Hello and welcome to the Silo Solving Podcast. I am your host, Danelle Marqui Brown. You can call me Day. And today's we have two incredible guests from two adjacent and in some ways overlapping walks of life in, as far as work and expertise go. So I'm going to introduce them to you both now, and I'm going to have to look down at my notes because their stories are incredible and I can't remember everything verbatim. So here we go. So as a theoretical and computational physicist and author, Stephon Alexander's work resides at the interface between cosmology, particle physics, quantum gravity, and music. He is a professor of physics at Brown University, the executive director of the Harlem Gallery of Science, and the former president of the National Society of Black Physicists. He's held previous appointments at Stanford University, Imperial College, Penn State, and among others. And additionally, Stephon is also a professional touring jazz musician. So welcome to Silo Solving, Stephon. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here.
Thank you. And also joining us is Erik Lawrence. In a catalog of music legacy, Erik is a saxophonist, flutist, sound and vibrational healing practitioner, educator, amongst other titles. He's played, toured, and recorded with legends including Levon Helm, Bob Dylan, Mavis Staples, Chico Hamilton, Aretha Franklin, Spin Doctors, Wilco, Glenn Hansard. The list continues. He's also on the steering committee for the Louis Armstrong Center for Music and Medicine and is the vice president of the board for the Wonderful World Friends of Music Therapy. So thank you, Erik, and welcome to the podcast.
I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you.
Pardon my scratchy throat.
No worries. I may have a scratchy throat too. I was under the weather for a little while, so it's all good.
You sound great, Erik.
Yeah, I wish I sounded like this all the time, actually.
So the intention for this podcast, so the theme is, initially the theme is creative problem solving within complex, like for complex problems. But because this is, the intention for this is to be a creative brainstorm, if you will, it's okay. It actually encouraged to color outside the lines. So if we kind of veer outside of that narrative of explicitly creative problem solving for complexity, that's okay, because that is the nature, if you will, of jazz and improv. And so I figured for the audience's context and point of reference, so prior to this, I've never, so this, Stephon, this is the first time that I'm actually having a conversation with you. Technically, I did speak to you in 2017, and that's when I came across your work and your first book, The Jazz of Physics. It was an event held at Jazz at Lincoln Center, and I probably said something like I was excited to read your book about the jazz of physics. And then that
was I friendly? Was I nice?
No, you're definitely friendly. I was there ironically, like in hindsight. This is kind of like pre-shadow to some of the things that we may talk about, but that was in your book that I didn't know that was in your book. I attended the event with a friend of mine who is a sculptor who so we were both designers and we pivoted in our careers, and she went more into sculpting and ceramics, but was studying like Carl Jung. And so I didn't realize, it was like basically a week after the event that I was like, oh my gosh, like I was just talking to my friend about psychology and like physics, and lo and behold, I got a book that began to brush upon that a little bit. But yeah, you're definitely very nice. And later that year is when I met Erik Lawrence, when I joined the steering committee as well for the Louis Armstrong Center for Music and Medicine. So we have like various levels of knowing each other. And so this is like an introduction into this kind of models how you can have, I'm inferring, have like creative brainstorms and just find synergies with people that you just met, you maybe known for a while, but never talked about a certain like topic. And so we'll see how that like unrolls. So I figured as an icebreaker, I would there's a passage, Stephon, in your first book, The Jazz is Physics. So I figured I would read that and then pass it on. Like, again, we're playing this like a riff, a jam session, if you will. And if you could just speak on what you wrote in The Jazz of Physics from the standpoint as a physicist, and then Erik, if you can riff off of that from the standpoint of a musician. So I'm going to read that passage. So it says, um, although it is important for both jazz musicians and physicists to strive for technical and theoretical mastery in their respective disciplines, innovation demands that they go beyond the skill sets that they have mastered. So, Stephon, can you just elaborate on that entry?
Yeah, I mean, I still, you know, I still live that. I still live that statement. That statement was more of a reminder for myself, actually. That's the first thing. But first, let me say congratulations on this, what I consider to be groundbreaking podcast. There's nothing like it, and I want to congratulate you for your vision. And I can speak. I'm sure I can speak for Erik too. It's truly an honor to be a part of this and to be the first of it. So, and also I'm a big fan of Erik. So love what you're doing. So yeah, you know, oftentimes, especially in these modern times, there's always an either or, you know, like oftentimes the notion of in any discipline, physics, which relies on, for example, as a tool, mathematics of all sorts, right? And it's one of those things where, yeah, the more math you learn, I'm now speaking as a theoretical physicist. I mean, in experimental physics, there's a whole other range of skill sets that I dare not even try to get into because I was a failed experimentalist when I was a student. But in that field, yeah, there's mathematics, there's what I call intuition building. There's a discipline that comes with the craft. And there are some people that maybe feel that that's good enough. You know, it's just good enough to know and just continue to learn the techniques, the skills, and all that stuff. But then one has to then invent and create and also push the boundary of those skill sets, invent new mathematics, maybe invent new ways of intuiting. So that statement was about that dance, okay, of like both respecting, mastering the traditions, and the techniques that come with it in physics and music. But also to realize that that is done in service to pushing the boundaries, and taking the discipline to the next level. And there's a level of courage, discipline, perseverance, persistence, community building, you know, and self-belief, because you're going to come across inevitably all sorts of resistance or, you know, headwinds to go through. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, well, that really moves me because of the way that I was brought up. My dad was a jazz saxophonist, and you know, taught me how to play the horn when I was 5, and just showed me the notes and said, "Now play what you feel." His name is Erik Lawrence, by the way. So, you know, so I've always done that, played what I felt. But then later on, I realized there was all these things that I wanted to learn in order to play like the players that I had admired. But I always knew that that one of the things that I was working towards was or that any jazz musician, I'm just speaking from my own personal experience, was to get to the point where you had an individual voice. Not realizing that from the time you start, you do have an individual voice. You want to leave that untarnished. But then you want to learn all the tools that you need in order to play this style of jazz or that style of jazz, or other styles of music or whatever. Um, and for the most part, I think musicians do that until they reach some sort of a roadblock that goes beyond their mental um, capabilities, or where all the things that you bring in, where you need them to synapse together, um, uh, don't don't and for a lot of musicians, I would say, like for swing musicians it was bebop, and for bebop musicians it was Coltrane's giant steps, period. I mean, like the hyper harmonic
Yeah.
stuff, and in that, where it was just like, whoa, we're not dealing with cycle of fourths anymore. We're dealing with like a different kind of elegant mathematics. And since I was a kid, people would say, you have to be good at math to be good at music. And having a somewhat mathematical and pattern oriented mind, I always think, I don't know. It seems to me like if you can count to 8, you can do pretty much anything in music, you know. Um, and if you're good at sequences, then either memorizing them or analyzing them, figuring them out right off the bat, then I think that you can work within the structures of music. But then there's the whole idea of the absence of structure in music, or
Mm.
structures that aren't apparent to the human ear,
Yeah.
so yeah. So I mean, there's more I could say, but you probably have something you want to say there, Yeah.
Yeah. Really, I was smiling on the inside with some of the things you were saying there. Um, I had last night. I was hanging out with my friend Will Calhoun, the drummer, um, and then he gets a phone call. It's like 11 something at night. We had just gone to the Zinc bar just reopened up inside, and so anyway, Bobby Watson calls him on the phone.
Wow.
But his first jazz album was with Bobby Watson, the great, one of the great, some people argue the living Charlie Parker. And I said to Will, hey, Will, can I get Bobby Watson's phone number? Because literally, I wanted to talk with Bobby Watson, basically get a lesson from him to address in part what you're saying. I wanted to understand, Charlie Parker and Ornette Coleman, that translation, and because Ornette Coleman said similar things to what you just said there, Erik. So
Hmm.
that, like, he was also interested in music. Clearly, that was built from the bebop or the blues tradition, but a sound that was, I've heard him say, also beyond human.
There's different levels of not only both physics and math, or I mean, you can theoretically argue that anything is connected to physics or sound and communication, but if you can speak to the importance of understanding the language and how there's variations in that language. So from a standpoint of music, there's scales, but there's different types of scales and different beats in that language of sonic architecture. And in the language of physical architecture, there are different languages, and how the mastery, or perhaps not even mastery, the understanding of that language allows people to build ideas out of those language structures. So if you can pivot off of that, if any of what I said just made sense,
Makes sense.
jump in.
Mm.
I'll let Erik go after first.
Okay. Well, I think that your answer is maybe easier than your question, because the fact that music is a language, and it's a language without words, if you apply what you know about the English language or any other languages you speak fluently, it's an excellent example of improvisation. Like, we come into this conversation now, Danelle, you and I have spoken, a number of times, and Stephon, we have never spoken before and never met. And but we all come in with our understanding of what we know, and we come in with our ability to express our ideas, and then we have a conversation to one degree of success or another. But usually, if we're, we can all say our words and say exactly what we know and say it over and over and over again. And I've never been in a position, probably as you have, Stephon, where you got interviewed 20 times about the same subject, and like you find yourself repeating yourself. But I've given a lot of lessons, and I find myself, trying to express the same idea over and over and over again. But eventually, you realize that you're expressing yourself, and you're saying it, trying to put things more and more simply every time that you say it. But exactly what is the saying? Like as simply as possible, but no simpler. And
Yeah.
was that Einstein? And and um and and that's how we do it. We improvise when we have a conversation with somebody else. We have no idea what they're going to say or how we're supposed to respond. We just have confidence in what our um, what our base of information is, and our ability to express it. It's just like, and another example I use for this is walking down a busy city sidewalk. Like we all know how to walk, but just getting from 74th Street to 75th Street is an exercise in improvisation. You know, otherwise we're crashing into each other and getting a lot of people angry. So
I want to agree 150% with Erik, and say so. When I was when I was younger, and I had these like fanciful ideas and like of jazz, of improvising musically, and also as as you said, desiring one day to be creative, to really write my first and publish my first physics paper, which meant that I had to invent with these equations new ideas, right? So again, it's a kind of improvisation as well. But that's what that book, The Jazz of Physics, was about, right? It was about looking at those connections in improvisation, the act of improvisation in physics research and in jazz. Um, but yeah, I when wanted those two things as a younger person, it took me many years to realize that what Erik just said is, it's as simple as when we speak, exactly when we communicate with language, right? A conversation where there are you don't know what the other person's going to say. That is the same type of improvisation that goes on in music and in physics. And let me say a little bit more about that. We take for granted, because when we were young, I took for granted that when I was young, that somehow that I internalized words, grammar, syntax, all these things. I guess people like Noam Chomsky tried to explain how that universal grammar works and how we can pick that up as young people. We do this by mimicking, of course, people. We mimic parents. We also, by mimicking, I mean like literally phrases might be committed. Phrases, context, all these things might be committed to memory, so that when we want to express an idea or make a prediction about something with words, or infer, what somebody is going to say, but all these things are acts of improvisation when we speak. And Erik, would love to hear your thoughts about this. But another, great teacher of the music and of the saxophone is Bill Evans, not the Bill Evans of piano, but Bill Evans, the tenor player who played with Miles Davis. And I had a fortune of speaking with him, and he said, look, something like bebop, which appears to be daunting in terms of like if you analyze it through the lens of music theory, right? The sort of like, oh, I'm playing a 2-5-1 or rhythm, all these rhythm changes, all these things that have to do with chord changes or time signal, all these things that are theoretical. And the analogy there is, that's like the math, right, of that's involved in physics. So there's this theory. And if you come at the music from that approach, and you can certainly do it from that approach, but if you come at this from the approach of thinking of bebop as a language, right, or the blues as a language, then let's see. I should then, listen to Charlie Parker, really listen, just like I'm listening to an adult as a kid speak, and commit and mimic to memory, right? And so one of the exercises that I still struggle with, by the way, is the idea. This is really interesting. I want to hear what Erik has to say about this. Here's one interesting thing. So there's this chord progression that takes you from a minor seventh to the something called dominant seventh to the tonic, right? That's just language. That's some technical stuff in music. It's called a 2-5-1. There are thousands of Charlie Parker and there's phrases from Miles Davis that when you listen to jazz music, right, you hear this movement through this chord progression in time, laced out in time. And so I can go and analyze note for note what's going on there theoretically and all the diminished sevenths and all the things I can play. But there's another approach, which was take that Miles Davis solo, commit it to memory in all 12 keys, get it under your finger, get it embedded, get it so internalized that it's like words that you're speaking. You have complete flexibility with it, right? And that is probably more effective in thinking about playing jazz than it's happening too fast for you to be analyzing it theoretically anyway, right? So in that sense, it is like what Erik said, like a language the same way. So to demystify things like jazz and like physics, right? It's just that you're learning a new language. You have to understand it, internalize it, right, to the point of where it's a part of you. Then you have the freedom and the flexibility to invent with it the same way we do with language. I sorry to take so long to get out.
No, that's great.
That's great. It's
Erik,
great.
what are your thoughts? I'm just curious.
Oh, well, I think that any stage in your playing, you can the only thing you can do is play what you hear, like what your ears are telling you, like, and it's a spontaneous thing. And I will make like one slight adjustment. Say improvisation is walking down the street. It is having a verbal conversation with somebody, but they say that music is maybe the only activity that a human does where they're using both sides of their brain at the same time. And that's the sort of X factor where you forget sometimes, but the truth is that if you're playing improvisation in a group setting, you have the opportunity to play with as much emotion as you possibly can. And a lot of people forget to do that. They play with some emotion, or they play with some creativity, but not all of their creativity. And then the people that rise to the top, like, John Coltrane, of course, is the best example, or Charlie Parker, they play with all of their emotion. Like you never hear them not having absolute integrity in every single note that they play, or, having absolute mastery of every note on their instrument. You know what I mean? So, Art Tatum, obviously, these are people that we as musicians look at and say, yeah, they were from another time or another planet, maybe, but I feel like we have this golden opportunity all the time and we don't take advantage of it, as human beings having the opportunity to advance, and maybe it's a fear of flying, but the excitement of it. And if you've ever been to a jam session where you'll hear 4 saxophone players lined up, and they all have similar technical ability and harmonic ability, but one of them hasn't worked on their sound, and one of them isn't putting any emotion into it, and another person comes up and plays even simpler, but you can hear the integrity in everything that they do, and that's the person that you remember, and that's the person who's going somewhere next. It doesn't mean the other people aren't going to, but those were the proving grounds. I don't know if they still really exist anymore. What's happened in schools has sort of disseminated that a little bit, different from, my dad sat at Ben Webster's feet, when he was a teenager, and Ben imparted all this wisdom to him, And I was fortunate enough to see all these people. But if you decide in your head that like Charlie Parker is the greatest jazz musician in the world, then the best you could ever do is play like an imitation of Charlie Parker, which is totally not what he was about, because he wasn't trying to play like anybody. You know, he never sounded like he was trying to play like anybody. You know, you know, and even if he did, it's just a phase of his playing, and he moved way past it because of that drive. You know, so. So in terms of jazz, Danelle, I don't know if that's all you want to talk about, but you know, the drive and the desire to truly express yourself in any form of creativity or improvisation, you know, the further you commit into that, the further you're going to be. I'll say one other thing too. I was really fortunate to play with the late great Sonny Chirac, like the last few years of his life, and he was an incredible mentor to me, you know. And I remember being at the very first festival I ever went to in Europe, and we were hearing some of the younger free jazz musicians who were just so thrilled that he was there, and they were in their sound check and they were trying to show off for him, and it sounded like absolute garbage. And I mean, to me, I was really, you know, like I listened to this music and I was just like, boy, I have nothing to grab onto here. I said, well, what do you think about this, Sonny? And he's like, let's take the bus back to the hotel. And he said, when we started the freedom movement, Pharaoh Sanders and I and a few other people, Sonny Murray and those guys, Milford Graves, and he said it was in tribute to the beauty that was always there in John Coltrane's music, you know, that maybe left some people in the dust, but we always heard that beauty, and we always wanted to create something that exhibited that beauty, but with the ability for us to express ourselves as freely as possible. And I don't hear that in their playing. That's what he was saying. It's just like, I just hear them doing all the messing around, but not necessarily with the emotional content, you know, that held them together, you know, or that made you feel something other than, you know, anger or frustration, you know.
Right.
So to pivot the conversation a bit, Stephon, can you talk about the role of diversity in cultivating innovation, and how maybe speak to silos in this structure of the STEM industry and how that can inhibit innovation being created?
Yes, absolutely. And I want to riff on what Erik just said, build off on what he just said, because I think it's like probably the ideal statement of kind of what it looks like, what diversity really looks like. We learned from Coltrane after John. I mean, no one can you know, argue, debate that just in humanity, Coltrane was one of the great like masters of the craft. You know, technically, theoretically, in all ways, John Coltrane was that person. No one practices harder than he did. Like, it's just, you know, the guy would fall asleep with a mouthpiece in his mouth. But after he like dropped Giant Steps, which was just basically that, you know, exclamation point, boom, here's like, you know, here's some chord changes that you're going to spend the rest of your life like trying to shed. He went free, and the person that everyone else in the community may have been sort of looking down at, which was people like Ornette and Pharaoh Sanders, Coltrane embraced them. He had Pharaoh Sanders play with him. And he made a statement, I guess, when people, in response to Pharaoh Sanders and people's critique, and he said, I've not heard anyone play with such conviction as Pharaoh Sanders. So this is kind of interesting. I also add this to another statement that one of my mentors, my first PhD advisor, Leon Cooper, who won the Nobel Prize for the theoretical understanding, quantum understanding of superconductivity, he would say to me, so he's also similarly like sort of one of these technical masters in terms of his calculational abilities and, you know, ability to solve problems in physics. And he would tell me the following. He would say it out of the blue: why should I want to only talk to people that know exactly what I know? So you put that in the context of somebody that's like a master in their quote unquote silo. It's like, I'm in a hall of mirror. I have nothing to learn necessarily than talking to people that know what I know and I include if I know a lot. So there's this need that both I think Coltrane and Leon Cooper had to speak to others who knew other things, because they're hungry to learn new things, to see how they could connect it with what they've mastered, because they understand that even what they've mastered has a horizon, has a knowledge horizon, right? There is a limitation that they want to break through. So maybe that's a strategy for them to get to that new ground. And that's how I've taken that. And I think that when we use the word diversity, it is sort of like diversity is sort of like this potentiality, right? That exists, provided that you do have a ground to stand on. I mean, it's not like if I have many options, I think about diversity as having sort of many options, many different things to pick from, but I lack the direction. Then it's sort of like I don't know what orientation, I need to pick from in terms of those options. So I think it's a dance. Diversity is, for me, having a palette. Yeah, here's one last analogy. I'm a painter. I have a palette of colors. I have a canvas. Okay, so I can paint with these colors. And now I say I want to expand. So it's important that I know how to paint with those colors, how to blend those colors, how to do all amazing things that Monet may have done with those colors. True master. But now I say I want to add some more colors to the palette. So to me, diversity and the importance of it is adding these other colors to the palette. But it's really important that you also, that you figure out how to integrate those colors with the existing colors as well. And that's hard work. And I think that it's hard work sometimes when you fall into the club mentality, or an us versus them type of mentality. So the hard work, and I think diversity is sort of is navigating those amongst other things, but those are two things that come to mind.
So there's a few definitions of what a silo is, but for contextualization and the kind of to help render the concept for why I'm trying to create this podcast and such discussions, I'm going to read like the first, just so you have an idea of where it comes from, and then the definition of how many people in corporate America and if you work in offices are most familiar with it. So the first, like according to Merriam-Webster's definition, the first explanation of a silo is a trench, pit, or especially a tall cylinder as a wood or concrete, usually sealed to exclude air and used for making and storing silage. And so it's basically like the air is being sucked out of this structure for to contain a certain matter. Now, the third definition is the one that you see coming up upon, like in the Harvard Business Review or the Stanford Business Review, in offices all over, in labs all over, in schools and institutions. It's everywhere. Silos everywhere. Hence, we need to solve that problem. So that definition is a silo is an isolated grouping, department, etc., that functions apart from others, especially in a way seen as hindering communication and cooperation. So those last two like words of communication and cooperation being kind of the victim of a silo, the problem that needs to be solved for is something that I'm really interested in across industries and within industries and offices. So I wanted to teeing that up, I wanted Erik, if you could speak to your work. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, you worked across various genres of music and worked with so many different artists and different styles of work. And so if I thought it was this interesting of like the story of the Midnight Rambles and knowing what a silo is, where there's like no there's no air to breathe. But then what the Midnight Rambles were, and that open door, and what was created in that open door barn.
Mm.
And if you could just talk about your experience with that, and maybe like kind of tie in how that led up to last year's release of a particular album that was like a remembrance of both yours and Mavis Staples' dear friend Levon Helm.
Right. Okay, so I'll stay away from diversity. I probably shouldn't say anything about that anyway. Although I would say,
like diversity in jazz, when it's
yeah,
not just I just want to just jump in, like, so yes, there's definitely, so the buzzword, there's so many acronyms and initialisms in corporate. So DEI, which stands for diversity, equity, inclusion. And yes, there definitely, I'll speak for myself, I do think that needs to be a lot of work and that from the standpoint of diversity and race and gender across like offices. But it's also just like, I want to talk about the standpoint of diversity and inclusion with like this like genres of thoughts, approach of creativity and sounds. And it's not as Stephon was talking about with paint, it's in painting, like you can paint a picture and that has kind of color tonalities, but there's also different emotions, like in different styles. You have abstract art, you have modern art, you have like, there's so many different nuances to a palette. So I just wanted to say that.
yeah. And I will say the one thing that what you said inspired me about the painting and the palettes. I mean, I'm not a very good painter, but my partner is, and but it kind of reminded me also of our understanding of the universe, which is constantly expanding. So we have this idea of like, this number of stars, solar systems, planet systems, and all this. And then all of a sudden it just gets blown wide open, and then we have to expand our ability to believe something more, and I think that happens when we're learning any art form, and I remember when I was young, um, and I was learning my notes, like what the notes meant and how I could use them. And, getting back to language. And I remember the notes that I didn't really understand and thinking, well, I would never use that note in this situation. Like if I was thinking about what I'm doing, I will never play a major third on a minor chord, and then later on, a few years later, I was just like, how do I make that work? And then I would experiment with it and it became possible. And then I got a chance to work a little bit in an ensemble with Sam Rivers, and he just sort of blew it out wide open,
Wow.
in a couple of ways. Yeah, in a couple of ways. I don't know if you ever got to meet him, but
I got to hear him. I got to hear him in Oakland many years ago.
Yeah. So
Amazing.
So I'll tell you two things about him, which always really, really moved me. And I mean, Yusef is another one, and but and I will get to the barn, I promise. So and barns obviously are very different from silos, but the first was that I read an interview because my dad was a jazz musician. I had piles and piles of downbeats from the 60s and the 70s and stuff, and I would read them. And I read an interview with Sam in the early 70s, and he said, yeah, he says, everybody thinks, I was just, some poor black kid who grew up, on the streets of Boston. He says, but I came from a middle-class family, and, we were pretty good. And I was pretty talented when I was young. And when I'm paraphrasing him, obviously, but this was the idea, said, and every time that I'd hear about somebody who supposedly was playing something new that was coming into town, I'd go to see them play. I'd buy all their records. I'd transcribe all their solos and analyze them so that when I played, I knew that I wasn't playing anything like them.
Well said. Wow.
Which is deep, because then if you think about it, it's just like, well, there's two ways to be an original artist. One is to understand everything there is and then do something different, which is a sign of true creativity. It's like believing in the actual, like yourself as a creative person. So I could get past everything I know to do something I don't know, because the unknown is what creativity is all about. But somewhat informed unknown. It's really up to you, depending on, you know, what approach you take. Or the other one is to not listen to anybody anywhere, and to just totally create what you can create. But then that's reinventing the wheel. And I think a lot of people thought that Ornette was doing that when he showed up, but you know, we know for a fact that it wasn't true. But he just had a very, very highly evolved creative sense. You know, the other thing about Youssef was that, I mean, about Sam Rivers, was he said, you know, let's take, you know, what we call the Mixolydian scale, which is basically a major scale, but with a lowered seventh degree. He said, now what notes can you play? You know, like you build the blues scale on that. So you flat the third, you flat the fifth, and you flat the ninth. And, you know, and then you also have the other notes. But, you know, now you have the flatted ninth and the flatted third and the flatted fifth. You have every note in the chromatic scale between the root and the fifth. And you flat the sixth because it goes with the seventh when you're playing something that has a diminished flavor to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can also play the major seventh because it's a weak note going to a strong note, which is the root again. So that's every note in the chromatic scale. So he said, you know, if you have a dominant chord, there's no note you can't play. Now,
yeah.
how do you make them sound good? And that just blew my mind, you know, because I was just like, well, I'm trying to learn the rules so I can work with the rules, you know. And you know, and there he is with his own concept of diversity, saying, yeah, well, you know, like if you really look at the rules enough, you pretty much don't have any rules anymore, you know.
Yes.
So so that's really, really pretty interesting. And then just to go to the silo thing, you know, it was interesting when you read those definitions, you know, that a silo, the point of it is to remove all the oxygen from a situation. But the purpose of that is to preserve something, you know, and maybe the way we tie in diversity and silo mentality, if we think of silo as being a negative impact, you know, imposition on a situation, is that, you know, we're removing the ability for something to breathe and grow and change, and takes all the individual pieces, all those grains of corn that are in that silo, and say, yeah, all we need you to do is just be a grain of corn. We don't need you to show us what you can do, you know, like who you can really be, like what color is the corn, you know, like any of that stuff. So it seems to me that, you know, we just want to go around chopping off the tops of those silos so we can let oxygen into them. Now, what Levon did with his barn, and Levon was just like one of the most Zen-like master musicians I ever worked with in my life, and he could just pick up any instrument and make it and play the exact right thing for the music, and he could take master musicians and make them sound human, not worse, but like make them human, because he was so great that they had to be like, oh, you know, I mean, there was one night when we were playing at the barn, and Jack DeJohnette came in, and they played double drums the whole night, and I mean, they just looked each other in the eye the whole night, smiling. You know, it was an amazingly, first of all, unbelievable experience, and also it's just like this joyful thing to see these two people who are like up in the cosmos, and us sort of like just sort of hanging on to the, you know, to the propellers, you know, trying to go stay with them. But he also took good musicians and made them great all the time. He just made everybody better, you know. And when he built this barn, he had a natural acoustic sense of like exactly how the barn should be built. There wasn't one nail or screw in the entire building. It was all what they call post and beam or tongue and groove or something like that. And so it was all just the natural reverberation of wood. And he was a backwoods country guy from Turkey Scratch, Arkansas. And but one of the smartest people I knew, you know, and he would and the barn burned down two times. So he built it three times. Each time he made a slight adjustment so that it sounded just a little bit better. And he knew exactly where the drums should be and exactly where the piano should be. And, you know, and how loud we should play and everything like that, so that it just sounded perfect in there. And I've been, you know, to some, you know, I played in St. Patrick's Cathedral, and I mean, there's no place that sounds better than that barn. It's just incredible. And when you go in there, it's like it's like my it's like a sacred space, you know. It's like something magical, vibrational is happening in there, where, you know, people would come from all over the world, and we would just break into the first tune, and people just like burst into tears, you know. And I'd see it over and over and over again. And I was like, this is why I moved in the direction of learning about sound and vibration and how they affect people with healing modalities and stuff. Because I saw that he was a healer, you know. And I know some musicians that as soon as you hear them, you know, they're mystics, you know, or you know that they've got something else going on. But he didn't make any promises. He didn't make any claims or anything like that. He just did what he did, and people would walk out being healed, you know. And maybe not forever, you know, like, or whatever, but they would keep coming back. That people came back 200-300 times, you know, because they just couldn't get enough of it. They spent all their discretionary income, you know, going to the bar to see Levon, you know, and the band. And you know, it was a very magical thing to be involved in. And there's still some of that that's going on. And I would say, Danelle, you know, you brought this up, but it culminated in this magical week where Mavis came in with her band, and Mavis and Levon were like brother and sister. They knew each other going way, way back. And he was the only person who called Pop Staples by his first name, which is Roebuck. And they were really close. There was never anything romantic between them, but they just, you'd see when they sat down, it was on a whole other level, you know. And you know, unfortunately, he was having a lot of problems with his voice. He had throat cancer and COPD. But, you know, we made it through a blissful, like, 2 or 3 days of rehearsing. And then by the time we got to the gigs that we did on Friday and Saturday night, his voice was waning, and Mavis was a little tired. And, you know, and we got through it, and it was really, really special. And when we knew, like, by that point, like, Mavis had 3 Grammys and Levon had 3 Grammys, we knew it was the best thing that either of us had ever done. It was just incredible. You know, it was just like all barriers and obstacles were out of the way. And even with the scratchy voices, and Mavis got to redo some of her stuff, I think. And, you know, there was all kinds of issues after the fact, you know, but it was just like when you watch that Aretha Franklin, Amazing Grace, you know, just one of those magical, amazing moments in time. It was one of those, for me, it was, you know, incredible. Anybody else who was there, you know.
Thank you for sharing that. Like I never went to the Midnight Ramble, and one of the reasons why I wanted to bring that up and to bring it up in discussion was the fact that as the band, how many members were in the Levon Helm band? How many were you?
Well, at our full strength, we were 12 with 5 horn players. And Stephon, you would know these guys, myself and Stephen Bernstein and Jay Collins and Clark Gayton and the late great Howard Johnson, and who was there in the very beginning. And I just, sorry to interrupt your thought, but I want to tell a little story, because Howard, you know, was like a mentor of mine. And he was like, I call him the Art Tatum of the tuba, because he picked up a tuba and nobody told him you can't do things on it. So he just did unbelievable things on the tuba. And he got to New York about 2 months after Coltrane had recorded Africa Brass, at the insistence of Eric Dolphy, who just met him in Chicago and said, listen, if you can play half as much as you say you can play, then New York is waiting for you. And he got the gig with Charles Mingus, and he found himself on a double bill at Birdland, opening up for John Coltrane. He was playing with Mingus. So he said the night before he couldn't sleep at all. And he was thinking about what he was going to say to John Coltrane, who was such a inspiration to him. And I don't know if I ever met Howard, but he's a very unique and brilliant and jovial guy. Just this past week, it's 2 years since he passed. And he said, so I'm waiting to meet John Coltrane, and I'm practicing in the room, and I'm playing and running through my scales and my tunes, which is like unbelievable virtuosity on the tuba that nobody ever heard before. And he said, and he heard some guys walking by, and it was Coltrane and his quartet. And Coltrane popped his head in, and he's like, "How can you play so much tuba?" And Howard was like, "Oh, Mr. Coltrane, Mr. Like he didn't know what to say." And Coltrane said, "Man, I wish you were here 2 months ago when I recorded Africa Brass." And Howard said, "You wish."
Like
Yeah.
but that's like of the sound of brass, and like there was a particular sound that you all cultivated together, and the fact that there was different musical guests that would come to the barn and join in, and so it was kind of like a fusion of different genres. And so even though like I said, I never attended a Midnight Ramble, I realized in hindsight, so uh I have many. I love music in general, and an artist that I really like, whose music I really love, is Glenn Hansard, who you played with, and I listened to Glenn and his different evolutions of sound with his previous band as a solo, and I remember when there was an album that came out in 2015, and it didn't click until years later, and I was like, oh, that's called Didn't He Ramble? And when it came out, it was just like a different. I could, like I can't read music, but I could, um, though I can't read music, I feel like I have a good ear for it, but I could hear there was a different sound that was different from his previous work. And it wasn't it. So that album came out in 2015. And it wasn't until later that I did like reverse engineering. And I'm like, wait a second, did Glenn ever go to like a Midnight Ramble? And then once I listened to certain songs that, um, like, certain songs in the album, I could hear sonically how he was inspired by his experience of going to the Midnight Rambles, and actually found an article of that being discussed. And I just found that to be fascinating. And it just made me realize another, beautiful thing about creativity and co-collaboration, and the evolution of it across space and time and emotions. It's just like, and it's like the history of like I don't know, like rock and roll history, R&B, that stems from the blues and jazz. It's just like things build off of each other, and you can hear like it's sonic DNA in different sound structures. And so it is as an example of how different genres of music and different styles can influence other creatives to continue the catalog of life and culture. I think it's really beautiful. And so I guess, so I just wanted to say that. But then I guess just to kind of go back to Coltrane has come up a lot in the conversation, and he comes up a lot in both of your in your books as well, Stephon. And just if you can, you just speak to the the parallels of Coltrane and Einstein particularly, and how that anchors um, the storytell and the scientific and the technical aspect in both of your works, and physics and music.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, and I kind of want to anchor that back to the importance of, so another word that I think is synonymous with diversity is um, variety. Okay, variety, and also embracing acceptance, compassion, um, and also challenging. There's an emotional thing of like, inconveniencing, inconveniencing. The act of true diversity looks like, where your inconvenience, your comfort zone actually is challenged. I mean, I grew up in the Bronx in the 80s, and like when I say literally, like the neighborhood I was in was where, I mean, I will not name drop, but right, some of the the most important names in hip hop came from that neighborhood while I was going to know some of these guys personally, and girls. And so that neighborhood, when we moved into that neighborhood, was historically Irish, Italian, with a few Polish people in the neighborhood, and then then the neighborhood started bringing in folk from other communities of color in that neighborhood. And there was, again, there was we had to all figure out how to live together. And in that figuring out, something like hip hop was born. All right. So I think, I wanted to bring that back because one of the most uncomfortable things I had to learn, because as I started getting more and more into physics, I got more and more into philosophy, the philosophy of quantum mechanics. And then when I got into the philosophy of quantum physics, I got into studying Eastern philosophy, Confucian philosophy, Buddhist philosophy. I started looking at these other ways. And one of the most inconveniencing thoughts I had was that the self doesn't exist. So this is really important because let's consider this is actually true. But on a day-to-day, in a day-to-day situation, I feel a self. I feel, an identity. And depending on my interactions, some of that identity, depending on what, is reinforced. So if I'm treated in a racist way, then of course there's an identity of being, say, a Black person, a person of color in America. If I'm in the Caribbean and I'm in Jamaica, I'm a Trinidadian in Jamaica, So I find that all these different identities feel very reified, and it's very real. No one's going to tell me that I'm not Stephon Alexander, an African-American immigrant man in the United States. But the idea, though, that this at the same time, there's not a fixed self. I think that's a very important thing, because what that does, it opens me up to realizing that I'm subject to change. I'm subject to grow and learn. And that the way I interpret that is that this self is not something that's fixed in time. It has a potential. I think Herbie Hancock says it well in his album, The Essence. He talks about this. Shaka Khan has a song on that album, and just listen to the lyrics. I think that to me is like, that opens me up to actually to want to, again, exude compassion to others who may be very different than me, who actually may have divergent viewpoints. Because if I do believe in that idea, that actually this idea of the self, while it's very real, while emotionally it can put me in a silo and keep me in a silo, or reify that, or there's another reinforce it, that there is this potential, right, to grow. There's a potential to change and to create new things with others. But some of it is actually you have to embrace some discomfort. And no one is saying that you're going to go and, be a masochist or a sadist, but that's part of like, when we look at all the great things like hip hop music as a perfect example, we had to live in environments where it wasn't comfortable, but we had to figure out how to live together, how to make art together, and how to make music together. And that's what we call hip hop from the Bronx. So I just wanted to just come back to it like that and say Coltrane and Einstein were people that really exemplified that. Albert Einstein, when he came to America, right, and he was at the Institute for Advanced Studies. It's kind of interesting. There was a letter, I believe, the director from the director of this is Albert Einstein. He's top dog, right? He's it. But there's a letter that I want to say it was Robert Oppenheimer. It was Oppenheimer, who was the director of the Institute for Advanced Studies. And the letter went out to the faculty at the Institute, warning them to not hang out in the local Black community. That letter was basically directed to Albert Einstein, because Albert Einstein ventured outside of his comfort zone of the Institute and broke bread and hung out and had family friends with the African-American community that at that time were, mainly functioning as the servants in Princeton, New Jersey. So that's an example, I think, of Albert Einstein's spirit, that he wasn't just somebody that remained in his comfort zone. Like, he really, by the way, and discomfort and the emotion of discomfort actually can be a beautiful thing. getting sort of like, what's the word? Getting acquainted with that, acquainting yourself with that, right? And I'm saying that, by the way, because after this thing, I'm gonna go and get on my horn and get into that discomforting place of blowing long tones for like heaven knows how long, and feeling the frustration of my lips. I see Erik is shaking his head in agreement, and I think when we talk about diversity, we oftentimes don't talk about that discomfort. And it's really, I'm talking about any form of diversity, by the way. So I kind of threw a lot because I want to kind of put that on the palette. And I'm going to stop right there.
In reflection of the conversation that we just had, and the theme of this podcast and the initial episode theme of creativity in problem solving for complexity, if you just had any last words for each other or to audience, whatever comes out.
I can speak from the point of view of someone who's been in bands, excuse me, and and even to use Levon's band as an example, where we had 12 very unique and different personalities, all of whom probably had some sort of personality deficiency that would come to the surface not long after they got off the stage. But we found a way to like create this amazing cohesion when we worked together. There was a real love for each other, for everything that we would do. There was no presumed hierarchy. There was just listening and responding and making space and taking space when you're given it. And I mean, I took a course last year that was sort of like this inner game of business kind of course, because I wanted to launch my own business around music meditation and stuff like that. And they talk a lot about diversity and mindfulness, but I think it's something as musicians, we flow through fairly easily. I mean, it comes up in every aspect of life, and there's all kinds of issues, and people are constantly pushing agendas and stuff like that. But I've just always found that if there's, Dizzy used to talk about, he was a Sufi, and he would talk about this hierarchy of people that you meet having some degree of a message for you, the highest being like a prophet, and that you should approach everybody that you meet, that they may have an important message for you, no matter how lowly their station or how high it is. You just say, who is this person? When you look them in the eye, what do they actually have to say? And how sure of themselves they are, or even beyond whether they're sure of themselves or not. And and if I think we all kind of treat each other like there was a possibility of that person doing something great, or doing something valuable, or having some sort of internal insight that made themselves and the world and the people around them better, then we probably, I probably sound like a 60s hippie right now, but I feel like it would be a much better world. And in terms of all the grains of corn in the silo, I know there's a reason that they're in there, like that people are saving them up, for the billionaires who are going to live on Mars someday or something like that. But I just plan on staying on this planet and playing some beautiful music and making people feel good, and let them have their next planet, and
Right.
yeah. So that's all I have to say. And thank you, Dana, and thank you,
Thank you, Erik.
Stephon.
I think that I resonate with what Erik had to say. I will just leave with maybe a question for the two of you. First, the question to the hosts is, what is one of your favorite songs? Because I want to listen to it and see what I can get out of it on my instrument. And what would that be?
That is a challenging question.
Okay, one of your favorite songs. One of them. Yeah.
So I will say on theme. So one of my favorite artists is Tori Amos, and she actually has, as you are a physicist, so it is one of my favorite songs. But as a physicist, you will appreciate there's a song called "Bang," and if I was a physics high school teacher, I would teach this song in the class so people can learn the periodic table. But it's but not only does I like it because it does integrate it's the lyrics, but it's dualistic. So it talks about, it actually incorporates science, but it also talks about off the top of my head, I might get the lyrics a little bit off, but it's just like, it's talking about how we're all made of stars, but she's using that as a metaphor from the standpoint of the particles and the Big Bang, but then also to what inspired her to write this song was around the time when there was a lot of things happening with immigration and talking about we're all immigrants. That's all we are, because we're all made of stars. And so she talks about the social, the political, and the science. And the fact that she can do that is a reason why she's one of my favorite musicians. So Tori Amos, she's a pianist. And the song is called Bang.
Well, and then thank you. I will listen to that later on today for sure. And we'll use it in one of my classes.
Oh,
there you go.
And then for Erik, my question is, as a sax player, I play tenor. I'm always trying to, and soprano, but soprano is more challenging. But if there's something that you found that has been useful for you as a musician that I could incorporate and practice, what would it be?
Oh, I thought you were going to give me the easy question. One of my favorite songs. No. And well, I mean, you said long tones before. I think it all comes down to sound, and
okay, what else? What can I do to improve my sound?
Yeah, well,
I agree with that.
Yeah, my favorite long tone exercise, or two of my favorite long tone exercises are working with the overtones. Just
can you explain to the audience what a long tone exercise is?
I can't demonstrate right now because I can barely breathe. But so a long tone exercise is where you learn to control your breath, and you take a very, very deep breath, breathing diaphragmatically. Which if I told you to take a deep breath, most likely you wouldn't do that. You try to fill your lungs with air, and that's not the way we actually breathe. So you fill your diaphragm with air, and then you use that air judiciously, quietly, slowly to express a sound and try to get a quality sound, and at various different volume levels, depending on, so that you learn how to control your air and how much air you're putting out, your muscle control in your mouth. And then you learn to hold that note for as long as you possibly can, which I would say probably at the height of my long tone practice was maybe about a minute and 20 seconds, something like that. Obviously, on the soprano, it's a lot harder. It's a lot shorter. You would think it's less because it's so small, but it's actually more pressure. So, I would drive around in my car with my soprano mouthpiece, trying to play long tones, trying to play scales on the mouthpiece, So, and these are two things that Dave Liebman taught me when I took lessons with.
That's crazy. As I was thinking about asking my question, I was thinking Dave Liebman in my head. That's weird.
Yeah. Yeah. So he wrote that great book called Developing a Personal Sound. And it's really like the science of sound, on the saxophone. And so I would say I like to, first of all, I'm a big fan of subtone, and not everybody is, but I could play which is to play very softly the bottom of the horn with a big warm sound, and then try to push past resistors so that all of a sudden you're playing an octave higher, and then you're playing a fifth higher, and there's a natural overtone sequence, which you're a physicist. I know I don't need to explain it to you, but it's the same no matter what note you're playing. And, and see how high you can take it up, but make sure that you have enough breath to get it back down again and to be able to control that. And I find if you can control that, then it's going to open up the range of where you sound good on your instrument, And the other thing that I really like to practice is what I call sitting on the fence, which is, you take a note that has very little resistance, like a B or C or C sharp or something like that, in the middle of the horn, and just blow air into your horn using that fingering and push it until the point where the note is just about to break through, and hold that spot. So it's like you're sitting on this razor sharp fence where if you give a little more air, you're getting a note. And if you give a little less air, you're just getting air. So you're just at the cusp where the note is coming out, and then do that for long tones. And then once you could do it with the low resistance notes, then do it on the high resistance notes. Once you go from C sharp to D, all of a sudden you're like full resistance with D, with the octave key, and I find that helps you to get a really good even sound. And not only an even sound, but the opposite, so that, like you can make that D sound as stuffy as you want, but you can also make it sound as clear as you want. And I think that was a direct pathway to get me there,
Thank you.
Yeah. And for a song, I would say, and it's funny because I never realized the physics implications of the song, but I always love the song "East of the Sun, West of the Moon."
Oh yeah, that's a great song.
Yeah, and it's a unique song because the guy who wrote it wrote this brilliant song while he was going to Princeton, and very few people go to Princeton for music, and he drove to New York to sign a publishing deal with Harry H. Fox and whoever it was, and driving back, it was in the winter, he got in a car crash and died. So it's the only song he ever wrote.
Oh,
It's
wow.
a beautiful song. Wow.
And it's an incredible song. Yeah. And there it is. It's physics. It's the cosmos. It's east of the sun and west of the moon,
Joshua Redman played a version of that, didn't he?
Beautiful version.
Yeah,
Yeah.
beautiful version. Great solo on that. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much to you both. I hope that you enjoyed this experience. I am very happy to have had to be a witness to both of your conversation, and my brain is going to be continuing to spin after this. So thank you both, and yes, thank you for joining this episode of the Silo Solving Podcast, and continue to look out for future episodes.